Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Sylvester. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at UMass Dartmouth. I want to thank everyone for coming to our latest entry in the Corsair chat series. We have a packed house, even though it's virtual. That participant number keeps climbing extremely high. We have over 800 people registered for today's Corsair chat. And it's a testament to our entire UMass Dartmouth community caring about very important things going on and important world events. And we're excited to have one of our amazing experts here to share his expertise on the topic. Today, we're going to hear from UMass Dartmouth Professor of History, Brian Glyn Williams. After Professor Williams completes his presentation on the Russian war in Ukraine, we're going to have the ability to take questions from everyone. In order to ask your question, on the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a Q&A feature. Please feel free at any point that you have a question to put those in. We are expecting a lot of questions, and we're going to do our best to get to every question that we can. So don't feel like you have to wait to the end to start posting those questions in. Please keep them coming, and we'll make sure that we do our best to get to as many, as I said, at the end of the presentation. Now, Dr. Brian Glyn Williams has been a professor of history at UMass Dartmouth since 2001. He has traveled the world as an academic researcher and a U.S. military and CIA advisor, seeking to understand the nature of conflicts. Much of his time has been spent in Afghanistan, working alongside tribal groups to resist Taliban rule. His work with the Afghan warlord General Dodson was featured in 12 Strong, a recent movie starring Chris Hemsworth. Dr. Williams has also spent considerable time in Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia. He has authored 3 books on this area of the world and the building conflict that he will discuss today. His most recent book on the subject, The Crimean Tatars from Soviet Genocide to Putin's Invasion, is available for free in PDF form. We're going to be sharing a link in the chat. So if you want to click on that in the chat and download that, it's going to give you an opportunity to learn more about the historical run-up of this current war. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Professor Brian Glyn Williams, who will start by explaining how we got here. Thanks so much, Professor Williams.
And thanks so much, Joshua. And thank you also, Ryan Merrill, for helping organize this. And for all those out there listening, it is so gratifying for me to have this attention and this interest in this issue that is so personal to me. I'm so honored to be able to share the story about the people of Ukraine who I've known ever since 1986. I first visited Ukraine as a young undergraduate, and I lived in Soviet Kiev, and I fell in love with the people of Ukraine back then. Since then, as Josh mentioned, I lived in the Crimea and wrote 2 books about that experience. And it just is so heartwarming that people care. In a world where so many people care about, I don't know, who Kim Kardashian is dating more than the suffering of people in a democracy who are dying under an invasion, it is such an honor for me to come on and share my story. So my sort of focus, my real niche in history is trying to analyze and chronicle and historicize events that are happening right now. So what I'm going to try to do is what I did in the U.S. Army for 7 years when I worked for the U.S. Army's Joint Information Operations Warfare Command. I'm going to try to do a brief history of what just happened. I'm going to try to take the events of the last almost 2 weeks and give a history of what I call Operation Shock and Awful. This is my nickname for Putin's special military operation in Ukraine. By the way, you can't call it a war in Russia. If you do, you can go to jail for 15 years. So I'm going to look back and try to tell us what happened in the last almost 2 weeks. So we go back to February 24th. Vladimir Putin invaded a democracy, a country of 40 million that was leaning towards Europe. It wanted to join the European Union and NATO. His plan was to swiftly go into this country and overthrow is democratically elected leadership led by Vladimir Zelensky. You had a lot of propaganda in Russia in the last few months saying that Vladimir Zelensky was a Nazi, that his regime were Nazis, which is ironic because Zelensky is a Jew. But that's propaganda for you. Anyways, the operation began in a sort of attempt to duplicate America's Operation Shock and Awe. For those of you that don't remember that, back in the year 2003, George Bush Jr. launched an invasion of Iraq from Kuwait, a regime change invasion to overthrow a dictator named Saddam Hussein. I'm sort of proud about how our military operated in that campaign. In less than 2.5 weeks, US troops who'd flown from across the globe, by the way, raced up the Euphrates Valley, the 3rd Infantry Division. They fought their way through towns like Nasiriyah and Najaf. Then they moved west and captured Saddam Hussein Airport. Then they sent a small thunder run of troops blasting into downtown Baghdad, and they captured Baghdad, a city of 8 million people, and overthrew its government. Saddam Hussein was arrested and executed. This is Operation Shock and Awe from the year 2003. This was the model. This was the template that Putin tried duplicating on February 24th in his attempt to do a shock and awe and a regime change overthrow in Ukraine. But we have a lesson to learn from our own occupation, because as soon as we overthrew the government, we became occupiers in a hostile land. Phase 4, occupation. You may remember George Bush Jr. famously landed on an aircraft carrier, and a big sign behind him said, "Mission accomplished." And then he prematurely declared an end to military operations. So that's the US model. We became occupiers. We'll see where that went. Of course, we lost 4,500 troops occupying Iraq, and the war cost $2 trillion. And George Bush Jr. was blamed for this quagmire. And when he left office, he had the lowest presidential rating of any president in history. His ratings were lower than Nixon's. In other words, occupation of a hostile land involved America in a quagmire. Even though we won the initial shock and awe phase of the invasion, it became a war that went from 2003 until 2011. We were told by Bush we'd be out in 3 months, but it became a Vietnam-style quagmire. So that's our model, the model of shock and awe. Now let's look at what Putin did in Ukraine in the last almost 2 weeks. He attempted to do the same thing we did. He sent in his special forces called Spetsnaz to try coming in by air and seizing the main airport just outside of Kiev, the capital, or Kyiv, as they call it. The plan was then to have these special forces fly in giant transport planes and break into Kiev and seize the capital, just as we did in Baghdad back in 2003, when the 3rd Infantry Division did a thunder run and captured this city of 8 million people. But for Russia, things didn't go out so smoothly. Russian troops came in the aircraft, tried seizing the airport, and were destroyed and defeated by Ukrainians who fought back very effectively, often using a new weapon called a Javelin anti-tank missile. So they couldn't capture the airport and do a quick coup d'etat, which means they couldn't decapitate the government and do a regime change in just 1 or 2 days. Instead, they had to send in a land army from the country to the north, a dictatorship, an autocratic regime linked to Russia, known as Belarus. So a giant 40-mile column of Russian tanks and supply troops, armor carriers, and weapon artillery transports all began moving from Belarus 100 miles down to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, to try seizing it. But this is when the Ukrainians began to fight back. And this is how Putin underestimated them. He thought he could just overthrow them and put a puppet in power and bring them back into his Iron Curtain, just like Belarus to the north. But the Ukrainian people are the real heroes of the story. They began to fight back tremendously. Citizens, women, mothers, villagers began coming out and forming units, militias. They began joining the territorial defense units. And the Ukrainian army began to fight back with tremendous effectiveness. They crushed Russian troops around Kharkiv, one of the largest cities in the north. They smashed them over and over again. We've seen images of Russian tank columns being destroyed by armored personnel, weapons like javelins that can go through tank armor. They're shooting down Russian airplanes with stingers. They're fighting for every ounce of their territory. And Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has become the unsung hero of the war. He's being praised around the world. Unlike, say, President Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, who fled on a helicopter when the Taliban approached and his whole army melted, Vladimir Zelensky refused a US offer to be airlifted from Ukraine and said, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. He inspired his people, and across Ukraine, they're making the Russians pay a heavy price in blood for capturing territory. According to the latest estimates, the Russians have lost more than 5,000 troops already in this so-called special operations military event, or this Operation Shock and Awful. They're being bogged down across the country as Ukrainians become a nation at arms. And the West is helping them. The Biden administration has given already $1 billion worth of weaponry and supplies to the Ukrainians. We've closed down their ability to use MasterCard and Visa. No more Netflix, and Hollywood's banned them. Volkswagen, BMW, Shell Oil is moving to ban them. Even TikTok has banned Russia. What's life without TikTok? So the Russians are facing sanctions that are devastating. The ruble lost 25% of its value in one day. Interest rates on houses, for example, went up from 9% to 20%. Life savings are evaporating. People are trying to make runs to the bank. There's no bank money for them. So the Russians are suffering, but they're standing strong because they believe in this propaganda, that they're invading a country to save themselves from weapons of mass destruction, similar to our propaganda by the Bush administration back in Iraq. So the West has come through in ways Putin never thought they would. Under Trump, he saw a West that was very pro-Russian. America was very strong in support of Putin under Trump. We called him his friend. And he actually extorted the president, Vladimir Zelensky, and told him, I'm not going to give you these Javelin missiles until you give me dirt on a Biden candidate, Biden. So he saw America as not really being strong in defense of Ukraine under Trump. He saw him as a pawn in his attempts to overthrow Biden presidency under Trump. But Biden has come through, and NATO has come through. Even Germany, which has a law that won't give weapons to belligerents, has begun sending these Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Sweden and Finland are thinking about joining NATO. So he's unified the world. He's unified NATO. And he's turned, I think, 2/3 of the world's countries are now doing sanctions against him for this brutal invasion that we're seeing on TV. And I find it fascinating that the Republican Party has had a sort of romance with Putin under Trump for the last 4 years. But even Fox News has sort of turned against Putin. At the beginning of the war, Tucker Carlson came out and said, I don't have anything against Putin. He never did anything to me. And several Republicans came out and said, why do we care about Ukraine? We should care about the border. But now the Republicans have finally sort of turned against Putin, and this cult of personality that was sort of sponsored by Trump when it came to the cult of Putin's personality seems to be ending. And I think Putin is surprised that both Democrats and Republicans are now rallying against him, and NATO and the European Union and almost the whole world has turned against him. Even China has begun to turn against this invasion. So in a nutshell, Operation Shock and Awful is going against Putin. It's become a quagmire already, and they have not even succeeded in occupying the capital yet. But having said that, Russia will bring in its heavy artillery and its bombers. Artillery is called the god of war. They're already flattening cities. They destroyed a whole city called Mariupol just in the last 5 days. They will kill civilians. They will pound cities to rubble. Putin is a city killer. This is the man who destroyed the city of Grozny, a city of 500,000, and turned it into a Caucasian Hiroshima when Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, tried breaking away from Russia in the year 2000. Putin also destroyed Aleppo, the largest city in Syria, using banned weapons, cluster bombs. Russia will engage in mass war crimes to achieve its agenda. It will flatten cities. It will kill tens of thousands of civilians. It has the advantage in heavy weaponry, armor, and in the air. It will bomb these cities and kill the Ukrainians, civilians, for their men and women daring to stand up against them. They will, I think, eventually conquer much of Ukraine and potentially even crush the capital itself due to superior firepower and Putin's complete indiscriminate civilian killing tactics. But then they'll come to phase 4, occupation. And that's when the insurgency will begin. And as we saw in Iraq, when almost 4,500 Americans came home in caskets, occupation is a long haul. And it's a bloody long haul, and it becomes a quagmire. So that's the future of the war as I see it. That's how we got here. I'll turn it over to Josh and questions now.
Thanks so much, Professor Williams. That was great. And thank you, everyone, for all the amazing questions we're getting in the chat. Again, if you have a question you'd like answered, you can go to the Q&A tab on the bottom and type it in, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Professor Williams, the first question involves urban warfare, and if you can explain the concept of urban warfare and provide any examples of urban warfare in any other conflicts.
Yeah, that is a very superb question, because that leads me to where we're going in the war. You know, the Russians are already encircling Kiev, the capital of 3 million people, and they have a lot of experience in urban warfare. This is different than mobile warfare, you know, say fighting tank, like we had in Iraq in the first war, the Battle of Kapiji back in 1991. This involves troops ceasing to be as mobile and going into what we call an urban forest, fighting street by street against defenders. And street fighting can become bloody. And the one thing we know from history is that when you have a mobile army with an advantage in weaponry and tanks and artillery, for example, like the Russians had when they went into Grozny, Chechnya, back in '94, or when the Nazi Wehrmacht, the Nazi German army, went into Stalingrad back in World War II, back in 1941-42. When this giant mechanized army tries to penetrate the urban forest of a big city, it loses some of its advantages. You know, the defenders can move through rubble, move through buildings, turning into a quagmire, fighting in the sewers, coming up and popping to destroy the enemy and hiding again. In Grozny, Chechnya, for example, the Chechens fought back against a much larger army of 60,000 Russians, and just 6,000 Chechens held that city and defended it for months after month after month, and ultimately killed 7,500 Russians. Stalingrad, the Nazis were victorious. They're on the march. They went up against Stalingrad and lost 850,000 troops. So I think the Ukrainians are already preparing to turn Kiev into a new Stalingrad, a new Grozny, to fight street by street by street, to make them pay for every ounce of territory, every foot of territory. And this will bog down the Russians in the one thing they don't want: urban warfare, an urban quagmire, like the ones, you know, even we fought when we fought in Mosul, the Battle of Mosul back in 2017-18. Just 3,000, 4,000 ISIS defenders bogged down an army of 100,000 for 9 months.
Thank you. The next question is, Russia has bombed hospitals. Will President Putin, be charged with war crimes?
Yeah, I saw that news just today and yesterday, that he already flattened several hospitals, wiped out a hospital with patients in it, in Mariupol in the south, the city that he has utterly destroyed. I know the ICC, the International Criminal Tribunal, will try convicting him for war crimes. They're already calling for him being prosecuted for killing civilians in multiple cities. The United States is on board. The European Union is on board. So I think when we start getting more evidence of his mass war crimes, he's already forced 2 million people to flee in the largest migration of civilians since World War II. He's already flattened towns and villages, and he's going to do much worse to come when he gets to Kiev. So I think he will have calls for his prosecution in The Hague for war crimes, just as, for example, Slobodan Milosevic, the head of Serbia, was prosecuted for war crimes in Bosnia and Croatia back in the 90s.
Thank you. Should we expect any countries in America or Europe to send troops?
No, I think we learned our lesson from the Iraq War. We were fed a pack of lies about weapons of mass destruction that just weren't there. We bravely sent in our army of 130,000. Ultimately, we had to do a troop surge of 168,000 to suppress the recession, this war, this insurgency. We've learned the price of warfare. When I worked for the military, my colonel said, wars work both ways, and insurgents don't vote the way we want them to. The last thing the Americans who just suffered from the Iraq quagmire want to do is involve themselves in a war in Europe. We learned the lessons from the Iraq War. And certainly NATO has not included Ukraine yet. They're not a member of NATO. So it means that Article 5, which says that if one member is attacked, they're all attacked, can't be used. So there is no calls for any NATO troops to go into Ukraine or American troops. Sadly, that means that the Ukrainians are on their own. They're fighting this battle against a massive invading army on their own. But at least they're getting a lot of support from NATO, especially these equalizer missiles, like the Stinger anti-aircraft missile and the Javelin, and of course the sanctions on Russia will hurt. And I think that's as far as we can go at the moment. Sort of wage a proxy war, like we did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the 80s. We supplied the Mujahideen, the Muslim Afghan rebels, with weapons, and we made the Soviets bleed. I think we're going to try to do the same tactic on a much larger scale in a country with 40 million people and let Ukrainians bleed the Russians and make this invasion as costly as possible for them without putting US troops on the ground.
Right. What is the likelihood that Putin will invade other former Soviet bloc countries, or does he just have his eyes on Ukraine?
I think it all depends on how things go in Ukraine. He expected Ukraine to be a cakewalk. He thought he could go in and overthrow his government. He didn't expect the people to be so patriotic and to fight back. And he didn't expect so much NATO support. Once again, under Trump, the Americans weren't really supporting Ukraine. Trump called Putin his friend, quote unquote. But I think he's been surprised at how resilient and determined Ukrainian resistance is, and how unified NATO support is. A few years ago, Trump wanted to pull us out of NATO, and he's fighting with Angela Merkel, the head of Germany, the biggest force in NATO. But now unified NATO is supporting the Ukrainians, and this has become already a quagmire for Putin. So if he wins easily in Ukraine, then of course he'll go for the Baltic states, those small states to north of Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They are the ones who are most afraid. They're members of NATO now. And I think if he feels emboldened by a quick victory in Ukraine, which seems elusive, then his next step will, of course, be to directly go for those Baltic states. And they are members of NATO, which means Article 5 applies to them, which means he'll be taking on NATO in a war.
Do you think internal pressure from Russians protesting the war could topple Putin?
It's a slim possibility. This country is like China. In China, they massacred protesters in Tiananmen Square. For all the fact that Putin has been embraced by Trump, this guy is just like Xi Jinping in China. He has crushed democracy. He's poisoned opposition leaders like Navalny and had them arrested and thrown in jail. He's shattered any opposition. The political parties that oppose them have all been closed down and arrested. Any opposition newspaper has been closed down in the last few weeks. There is no more voice really in the media telling the Russians the truth. All they're being fed is propaganda that Russia is liberating Ukraine. They call themselves peacekeeping troops. And they actually are being fed so many lies that Russians believe that their troops are being welcomed in Ukraine and that they're fighting Nazis. And I must say, Russian nationalism has a deep-seated anti-Semitism to it, going back for centuries. And in fact, that Zelensky is a Jew. I've had Russian friends of mine saying, well, he's a Jew, an atheist, and a Nazi. I'm like, you can't be a Jew and a Nazi. But the reality doesn't apply when you're being fed propaganda on state-controlled TV in a dictatorship, autocracy like Putin's regime. So sadly, as much as we'd like to have mass protests like we had 7 years ago, when the streets filled in St. Petersburg and Moscow and on Siberia with people protesting for democracy, Putin crushed those and crushed the democratic movements in Russia. So I don't see any upswelling of popular anti-war sentiments stopping this bloodshed in Ukraine.
Thanks for that, Professor. Thank you, everyone else, for the questions. They're coming in fast. We appreciate it. The next question is, what kind of fatalities are Ukrainian soldiers in resistance experiencing?
It's hard to know. The Ukrainians are taking a huge beating. They're up against an air force with superior precision-guided munitions. They're up against artillery on a scale they can't compete with, against higher armored units. And we don't know the numbers of people who are fighting against the Russians or who are dying. Part of this is because a huge component of those who are fighting and dying to defend their women, their children, their husbands, their wives, their homes, are these citizen fighters, average mothers and fathers who are fighting to defend their villages as part of the so-called territorial defense militias. They're not registered, so they're probably taking tremendous losses, defending their homes against this blitz, especially in the south. I shouldn't call it a blitz because in the north, as I mentioned, this column of 40 miles long troops has been bogged down and stuck by supply issues, by insurgent attacks, and by weather, and by lack of morale. Much of these Russian troops are 19-year-old conscripts. This is no professional fighting army like the 3rd Infantry Division that stormed into Baghdad back in 2003. These are conscripts who weren't even told they're going to invade Ukraine until they drove into the country. They've been lied to. So morale is terrible in the Russian army, and morale is high amongst Ukrainians who have a reason to fight. But we don't know the death toll. Ukrainians aren't letting us know. What they are letting us know is how many Russians are dying. This can't be verified, but the last stat I saw was that over 5,000 Russian troops have been killed, which is more than we lost in Iraq from 2003 to 2011. The Ukrainians claim to have blown up 1,000 armored vehicles, to destroy 275 tanks, and shot down 79 Russian airplanes. So the Russians, if these stats are right, are really having a hard time and are losing weapons and troops on a level we never lost in any of our wars since Vietnam.
Thank you. And I know, everyone, we had this chat scheduled till 12:30, but Professor Williams has graciously volunteered to stay a little late, and we're going to do our best to get, because we have so many really good questions here. And I appreciate that, Professor Williams.
Sure.
I know you spoke to this, but as a historian, have you ever seen this kind of unilateral international support for a nation under attack?
This is unique. We did have a case of the Serbs going into Bosnia, 94, 95, 96, and doing genocide. They wiped out, I think, 7,000 people in one day in a village called Srebrenica. And the whole world community came against Serbia at that time under Bill Clinton. NATO, the European Union, the UN, and you had these massive sanctions on Serbia. And ultimately, the U.S. attacked Serbia, blowing up troops and bridges in downtown Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. And we ended the war in a very multilateral fashion. The whole world joined in these sanctions and the war against the Serbs in Bosnia. We've also seen the world sanction Sudan for genocide in Darfur. In Myanmar, they overthrew the government and the world sanctioned them. And certainly when Iran began building nuclear weapons, the world sanctioned them. But the sanctions against Ukraine are simply unique in history. To have the SWIFT code, for example, I've never heard of this. The SWIFT code is a basic means for transferring money through banks internationally. We came out against Russia using the SWIFT code. That's the nuclear issue, nuclear trigger issue, and we banned them. We've hit their economy on so many levels. NATO has poured weaponry in. Even the Germans, who at first said we can't give weapons to belligerents, even the Germans, whose constitution says you can't give weapons to belligerents, are now sending weapons to Ukraine. So if Putin wanted to dominate NATO, dominate Europe, dominate the world, all he's done is galvanize the whole planet against his country. I've never seen a country have its currency tank so quickly as the ruble, the Russian currency, did. I've never seen the entire world make a hero out of a leader the way Vladimir Zelensky has been made a hero. And Russia is hated across the globe. It is a unique phenomenon that this country has had the whole planet turn against it. As I mentioned, even the Chinese are now distancing themselves from their fellow dictator, Vladimir Putin.
No, that's great, and a great transition to the next question, which is how is China demonstrating a break with or lack of support for Russia?
Well, it's interesting. Just before the invasion and just before the Beijing Olympics, they signed this deal saying that they're basically going to be support one another no matter what. So they had this alliance, almost like an alliance of evil, between the two world's greatest, darkest, most authoritarian dictatorships. They're equal in my mind. There's no difference, except for one has gone on the warpath and has invaded a country. For all the fact that if you watch Fox News every night, they're screaming about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, a non-existent invasion, by the way, of Taiwan. The real invasion has occurred by Trump's friend Putin, the Chinese see it for what it is. I think they're shocked at how hard the Ukrainians are fighting back. We should give them pause. Should they try invading Taiwan one day? Should they ever develop the amphibious capacity to invade this country? But I think they're shocked at how the world community has shunned Russia and how this invasion has turned Russia into a pariah state. And the Chinese are heavily invested in the West, heavily invested in America, and they are now disassociating themselves with this pariah nation, which has become an albatross around their necks. It's become a liability. So even the Chinese, who have no morality, they're doing genocide against the Uyghurs out there in Xinjiang province, the genocide against the Tibetans. They destroyed democracy in Hong Kong and are always threatening a democratic Taiwan. But even the Chinese, who have no sense of morality when it comes to foreign policy, are drawing back from their close alliance with Putin. He's toxic now. He's toxic.
What do you think about reports regarding Chechen fighters in Ukraine?
Well, this is fascinating. I've written a book on Chechnya and Russia's war in Chechnya called Inferno in Chechnya. And I got to know a lot of Chechens while writing this book, interviewing them. This small nation, a country about the size of Connecticut, stood up to the transnational Russian Federation from 94 to 96 and won the war and broke away from Russia. Small bands of maybe 6,000, 8,000 fighters crushed a Russian army of 60,000. This is a good model for the Ukrainians to follow, the way the Chechens fought as a nation of arms. Later in 2000, the brand new prime minister, a guy named Vladimir Putin, basically nuked the capital of Chechnya. He dropped things like fuel air explosives, which I should tell your audience about. He's deploying them against civilians in Ukraine right now. It's the most horrific weapon I've ever heard of in my life. I interviewed Chechen fighters and civilians who survived Russian fuel air explosives. It's a two-part bomb. One part drops and explodes weaponized gases, almost like hairspray, aerosol. And the second part is an incendiary bomb that then ignites the aerosol. So pretend you're a Ukrainian civilian, a mother, a child, hiding in the safety of your basement, and a bomb goes up on the top of the building. You're safe. But when a fuel air explosive goes off above your building, that weaponized aerosol sneaks in, it creeps into your bunker, your basement. You smell the aerosol all around you. And then the second part of the bomb, the incendiary bomb comes and ignites the aerosol, and everybody breathing it gets burnt alive. This is a weapon Putin used against women and children and civilians in Chechnya. It's banned by Geneva Conventions against civilians. He's using it in Ukraine today, on this very day, to incinerate and burn women and children in their basements, and men, civilians. This is how Putin annihilated, destroyed the capital of Chechnya, a city of 500,000 known as Grozny. He dropped in Scud missiles, thermobaric bombs, cluster bombs, and he crushed the Chechens, broke their spine. But a small group of Chechens actually fought alongside his invading forces and became mercenaries for Putin. His most devout mercenaries are these traitors to the Chechen nation who became mercenaries for Putin. And about a week and a half ago, Putin deployed a group of these very fierce fighters. They're Highlanders from the mountains of Chechnya, almost unconquerable. He sent in a unit of Chechen mercenaries to try invading Kiev and killing Vladimir Zelensky, the democratically elected popular president of Ukraine. This unit of Chechens was, however, spotted by CIA satellites. We warned the Ukrainians, and they ambushed it with US-supplied anti-tank Javelin missiles and blew up the entire column and killed all of the Chechens. So this is one victory for Ukraine over these mercenaries who were trying to kill the elected president of Ukraine. So as to your questioner's question, are there Chechens fighting in Ukraine? There were, but I think the main unit was wiped out and vaporized by these brave Ukrainians who killed them and blew up their entire column about a week and a half ago.
Thank you, Professor. Is there a realistic and political way to stop Putin, in your opinion?
We need to give this guy who hates the West, who hates America, who hates democracy. Trump may have loved him, but he doesn't love America. We need to give this guy who wants to crush democracy. He said he misses the day the Soviet Union fell apart. He wants the Soviet Empire back, the Iron Curtain. Ronald Reagan famously stood up to him instead of patronizing him the way Trump has done. He wants that empire back. He wants power and clout. He wants respect on the world stage for Russia. We need to find a way to give him an exit ramp, a way to save face, to get out of this quagmire he stumbled into, because this is going to be a forever war for Putin. When the Nazis invaded Germany during World War II, a country of 40 million, Ukraine has 40 million people, the Nazis deployed 3 million troops to occupy this large country. Ukraine's the size of Texas. It's a lot larger than France, and it also has 40 million people. He's trying to occupy it, a hostile country with just 150,000 troops. This will become a forever quagmire for Russia. We need to give him an off-ramp to get out. We need to, for example, to tell him, listen, we won't arm Ukraine anymore. We will perhaps acknowledge your annexation of Crimea, this peninsula I lived in on a couple occasions while writing my books. He annexed it in 2014. We, the world community, recognize the annexation of Crimea because it was formerly Russian territory until 1954, when Khrushchev, a premier, gave it to Ukraine. And perhaps we should recognize his annexation of Donetsk and Luhansk. These are two Russian territories out in the Donbass in the east that he also annexed back in 2014. These are de facto lost to Ukraine. We should meet them halfway and say, listen, we, the West, the European Union, America, and Ukraine recognize the loss of these territories. They are de facto independent states or part of Russian Federation, and we won't further arm Ukraine. And let's try to have a way for you to withdraw your troops, having achieved these objectives. You can claim victory, praise to Russia, praise to Putin, but you can't overthrow democracy. You can't bring Ukraine back into the Iron Curtain, and you can't deny new generations of Ukrainians the chance to vote, the chance to choose their own future, to make them slaves of your will, the way you've done in Belarus. We can't go that far. We're America. Around the globe, we support democracy, but we can give you these territories and meet you halfway.
The next question is, when do you think the 40-mile-long column of armored cars will advance into Kyiv? Sorry.
It's hard to know. That really is a $1 million question. Every day I'm watching this massive column. Part of me, as being in the military, I see this column as a parking lot. If America was involved in this war, and we sent in some A-10 Warthogs, or F-18s, or F-35 Raptors, or Apache attack helicopters, gunships, we would obliterate this column in 2 minutes, just like we obliterated an Iraqi retreating column back in 1991, and the Basra Road of Death, 24 miles of dead Iraqis. But the Ukrainians don't have the Air Force capacity to destroy this. They're sniping at it. They're slowing it down. They've slowed it down by opening up dams and creating mud around it. They've interdicted supply routes and stopping fuel and oil and ammunition from coming into this column. Morale is low in the column. The weather's against it. They don't want to be invading this country under Putin's lies, but they will eventually move. They don't seem to have command at the sergeant level to make them move this column forward. But eventually they will, I think, start moving, and they will move south and join the envelopments, the encirclements of Kiev. My hope is that it takes a long time, because the more time the Ukrainians have, the more they can fill the roads and streets of Kiev with cars and concrete berms, put in ammo depots, pillboxes for machine guns, sandbags for snipers. The more time the Kievans have to turn Kiev into Fortress Kiev, into a new Stalingrad, or a new Grozny, Chechnya, or a new Mosul, like it was for us a few years ago, the more they'll make it a quagmire and an urban battle for the Russians. I have no way of really knowing on the ground what's slowing this column, but it is absolutely shambolic. It is pathetic. And that column is why I'm writing an article right now called Operation Shock and Awful.
Thank you. Could you discuss the 2014 Crimean status referendum?
Yes, so this system is fascinating. Crimea is different than mainstream Ukraine. Crimea is a beautiful peninsula, by the way. It's called the Florida of the Soviet Union. The south coast is full of hotels, and it also has Russia's main naval bastion in the Black Sea, Sevastopol. So Crimea was a country, a province that previously belonged to the Muslim Crimean Tatars. Catherine the Great conquered it in 1783 and brought it into the Russian Empire and settled it with Russians. So it's been Russian ever since 1783, the same year America became independent. But then during the Soviet period, Nikita Khrushchev, the premier, he's trying to become head of the Soviet Union, he promised to give the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic the Russian territory of Crimea if they would vote for him becoming premier. They voted for him, and he gave them Crimea as a largely symbolic internal gesture back in 1954. But then, of course, the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. Ukraine became independent. And of course, in 2014, they had a big revolution, the Orange Revolution in Maidan Square, and they overthrew the puppet Putin wanted to have in charge of Ukraine and have rule this country the way he has a puppet ruling Belarusia. And they chose to join the West, to join the European Union, and maybe one day to join NATO, to punish them, the people in Crimea who are, I think, about 70% Russian, maybe 20% Ukrainian, and 10% indigenous Crimean Tatar. They had a referendum to vote to secede and leave Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. This is back in, I believe it was April of the year 2014. So in other words, the Russian majority in the Crimean Peninsula in April 2014 voted to break away from Ukraine as it was joining the West and go back and join the Russian Federation. And of course, this gave Vladimir Putin the pretext to launch his invasion in that month and send in thousands of Russian Federation troops. And they annexed Crimea, and now Crimea is part of the Russian Federation de facto.
How can we get involved in humanitarian efforts, and what are the most effective ways to give our help and support?
You know, I think we need to do a full-on offensive. You know, we've done this before. You know, remember when the Soviets tried encircling Berlin? We did an airlift to keep that city alive. We dropped in supplies to keep starving people alive in Darfur. We kept Somalia alive during the famine. The U.S. has tremendous airlift capacity. Now, this is the nation that back in August of last year evacuated via air, astonishingly, 125,000 Afghans. We have tremendous airlift capacity, U.S. does. We can do a full-on offensive to drop in air supplies, to keep this population alive, you know, do what we did to keep people alive in those countries, you know, from Darfur to Ethiopia in the 90s, to work with the United Nations, of course, UN High Commission for Refugees. We need to give them food. You know, they've cut off supplies of electricity. Food has been cut off for these people. They're starving. People are already starving to death in these Russian-occupied cities. So I think America is the guiding force behind the UN. We have more money, more power, more airlift capacity, and I think we can keep starvation from occurring in these refugee camps. You know, Poland has already absorbed, I think it's almost 2 million refugees. That's 2 million people who need to be fed every single day. This is the biggest humanitarian crisis since World War II. So it's going to take a lot of support from America, from both parties. You know, we got to see this as a Democrat thing and as a Republican thing. We need to stop seeing Putin as the golden child, and we need to see him as a serial killer, a mass murderer, and we need to save those Ukrainians from his mass murderers in any way we can. I think that involves, I think, on a citizens level, collecting supplies, to giving money to the UN, the Red Cross, and also the European Union, which is going to be absorbing millions of people in the coming days, weeks, and months.
Thank you, Professor. What is the realistic potential for groups close to Putin, the military, the oligarchs, to turn against him and remove him from office?
It's hard to know. You know, we don't have the sort of insights into people around Putin that we want. You know, he keeps a firm grip on his country. But there have been coups d'etats in the past. You know, they tried killing Hitler for making bad decisions for his country, militarily bad decisions for his country, back in the cold and of World War II. Beria, head of the KGB, was almost head of the Soviet Union, and he was overthrown and killed. So if there is going to be an overthrow of Putin, it won't come from the people on the streets, because they'll be massacred. It might come from the oligarchs. You know, these are the people who have the most to lose. These are his cronies who made their billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions by stealing the assets of the Soviet Union when it fell apart. They are losing a lot. You know, these are about 30, 40 oligarchs. They're having their yachts confiscated. These multi-billion-dollar yachts have been confiscated by the Italians and the French and the Germans. All their houses are in London. I used to live in London, and there's whole neighborhoods full of Russian multimillionaires whose families live there. Their kids go to Eton, their kids go to Cambridge. One oligarch owns Chelsea, a soccer team. Roman Abramovich, owns a soccer team in London. Their lives are built in Paris, especially London. Their children grow up speaking English. They don't want to have that whole world lost. Their billions lost. Their airplanes, their Learjets, their islands, their mansions across the globe on the French Riviera. These people live richer than even the Saudis do. And they're being hurt bad because we are targeting the oligarchs with our sanctions. The Biden administration, the European Union, many countries across the globe, Australia, New Zealand, they are seizing their assets. And this may just incentivize them. You know, the head of Rosneft, Russian gas, has been sanctioned. He's powerful. These are men who have their own followers, their own clout. They could overthrow Putin. The sheer fact that he's destroyed their economy, destroyed their livelihoods. And for what? To kill Ukrainians as a so-called a denazification campaign? How do they benefit from this war, which is waged just out of pure old-fashioned nationalist aggression? Wars like this aren't good for the bottom line for oligarchs when the whole world has turned against them. You know, they can't use their MasterCards anymore or their Visas.
Well said. We have a lot of questions regarding the likelihood of a nuclear weapon being deployed or the nuclear threat. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, you know, nuclear threats are the option of the weak party. Kim Jong-un has threatened nuclear annihilation with his Taepdong missiles, which can now reach, in 3 stages, they can reach Alaska. It is a way to saber rattle, to scare the world. Putin just announced last week that he's put his nuclear forces on defensive level. He is trying to intimidate us, trying to scare us, and he's a bully. You know, the fact that he's done this is hyper irresponsible. It puts us in a closer level to a nuclear confrontation than we've had perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis under Kennedy and Khrushchev back in the 60s. You know, you can't take anything off the table when it comes to a man who is about power and conquest and ego. He has personalized this invasion of Ukraine. It's about his own ego. He wants to crush, he wants to kill Vladimir Zelensky. He wants to kill democracy. And he's infuriated that the Ukrainians are resisting him, that they're uniting as a nation of arms, that women are fighting against him with Molotov cocktails, and the West is unified, and they're hurting his oligarchs and hurting his economy and hurting his people. He's infuriated and he's up against a wall. That means he's dangerous and irrational. You know, we can't predict what someone with his state of mind who's willing to kill and displace millions for no economic reason, just for glory. If he starts losing in Ukraine, might he drop a tactical nuclear weapon on somebody? It's hard to know, but we can't take that option off the table.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you everyone for all the questions. We are going to start to wrap up, and I want to give Professor Williams a couple minutes to answer these questions, which really comes down to what you think the best case scenario is for Ukraine, and ultimately, how do you see all of this ending?
The best case scenario for Ukraine is that they make this so-called shock and awful coup d'etat attempt, which was promised to the Russian people as a quote-unquote short victorious war. They make it as costly and bloody as possible for the Russian troops, that these conscript armies do get bogged down, that Fortress Kiev does become like Grozny or Stalingrad or Mosul, and the war becomes so costly in economic terms, in gold, but also in blood, that it costs the Russians so much that ultimately Putin is forced to do some retreat, confiscate, annex whatever, the Crimea and these 2 separatist regions in the east, Donetsk and Luhansk, and that the Russians do ultimately withdraw, and that they achieve victory, get to maintain the democracy for a new generation. They get to become the hero nation of the world, and that they get to join economically the world they want to join, which is the European Union, and become integrated into the European Union They've already discussed in the last week about fast tracking Ukraine into the European Union. So their hopes, the best hope, is that the West keeps supplying them with these javelins, anti-tank missiles, and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and all kinds of supplies, and that the war doesn't go on too long, and that they don't become a displaced nation of refugees, and that Putin does not put a puppet in power in Kiev and steal their democracy and bring it into his Iron Curtain.
Thank you very much. And I want to extend a personal thank you from everyone to you, Professor Williams, for agreeing to do this. I know you're out of the country, and the ability to come and put your time to this and share your expertise. And we're all very appreciative of you and appreciate the fact that you're part of the UMass Dartmouth community and all you do for our students. I know we got several alumni reaching out to us, and they were replying saying that you were their favorite professor and that you made an impact on their education. And we're truly thankful for you. So thanks again.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to you and Ryan for hosting me. And thank you for the students and the alumni in the community. Once again, I'm so personally touched by you caring about Ukraine. I have dear friends over there, families who I lived with, their children. And I'm worried about them. And it is so gratifying for me to be given this opportunity to reach out to people who care about the world, who are so concerned about people in other countries. And that certainly is our UMass Dartmouth community. We are plugged into other sufferings. We're not disconnected. And it really has been an honor and a pleasure to share my story with you. And thanks for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending. We will have a recording of this post on the website and on the Corsair network. And we obviously invite everyone to join the Corsair network. It's open to the entire UMass Dartmouth community, and we'll have more Corsair chats coming soon. Thanks again, and stay safe, everybody.